On the morning of December 21st, 1866, 81 men rode out of Fort Phil Kearny in what is now northern Wyoming. 40 minutes later, every one of them was dead. When the bodies came back, the post surgeon, Dr. Samuel M. Horton, examined them. His finding went into the official record, and it is the reason this list exists. Of 81 dead soldiers, in Horton's professional opinion, not more than 6 had been killed by gunfire. 6. The United States Army had rifles that day. And the Army wrote that down, in its own report, in its own hand. Everything on this list follows that rule. No legends, no campfire stories. 10 weapons, and for every one of them, a document produced by the United States Army. Number 7 is a Stone Age projectile that put so many soldiers in one Arizona hospital that the post surgeon published a paper on it in 1866. And number 4 is the moment an Army captain, writing as a serving officer, compared the rate of fire of a bow to a breech-loading rifle, and gave the bow the better of it. Hit subscribe because this list gets heavier the closer we get to number 1. Let's count them down. Number 10, the War Club. The simplest weapon here. A shaped length of hardwood, often carved to resemble the stock of a musket, sometimes fitted with an iron or stone striking edge set into the angle. No moving parts, nothing to load, nothing to jam. In the hands of a mounted man at speed, it delivered the combined weight of horse and rider into a single point. The Army's problem with it was arithmetic. The trapdoor Springfield in a trooper's hands managed something like 8 to 10 rounds a minute in good conditions, which means 6 seconds of helplessness between shots. A war club has no between. Across those 6 seconds, the older weapon was simply the better one, and every man on that ridge understood it. We know precisely how that arithmetic resolved at Fort Phil Kearny. Years afterward, the Oglala leader American Horse gave his own account of the end of that engagement. He said he had knocked the officer commanding from his horse with a war club and finished him with a knife. That account is not left standing on its own. It matches the physical evidence Dr. Horton recorded when he examined the bodies, and it sits in the record beside Colonel Henry Carrington's official report to his superiors. 2 sides of the same fight, 1 set of wounds. The Army counted them. Number 9, the knife. Most were trade blades, and a great many began life as something else. Lance points were cut down, reground, and rehafted. Broken sword blades were reworked. The blade in a warrior's belt on the northern plains in 1866 had often been forged in a European workshop and repurposed twice before it arrived there. The Army's fear of the knife was never tactical. It was about what a rifle becomes at that distance. Inside arm's length, a carbine is a 7-pound stick of wood and iron, awkward, slow, and pointed the wrong way. A knife at that same distance is at its absolute best. The weapon the service had paid for had turned into a club, and the weapon it was facing had not changed at all. The record here is unusually blunt. When Dr. Horton testified before the special commission convened after the fight, he described the condition of the officer commanding the column and stated that the man's throat had been cut crosswise with a knife. That is a serving Army surgeon, under oath, before a federal commission. The Army did not merely lose that engagement. It then sat down and took sworn testimony about exactly how. Number 8, the tomahawk. The iron-headed tomahawk was never an ancient weapon. It was a European trade good, forged in England, in France, and by colonial blacksmiths, and it moved west along the same routes as powder and cloth. The heads got lighter and the handles longer as the trade pushed onto the plains, better suited to a man fighting from horseback than to a man splitting firewood. And here is why it belongs on a list about the United States Army specifically. The Army did not only face the tomahawk, it bought it. Surviving specimens carry United States marks indicating official issue, and tomahawks were issued to American riflemen. The service put them in soldiers' hands as standard equipment. But arms historians examining those pieces have noted something strange. No written specifications for the tomahawks issued to United States riflemen survive from any period. There is no document describing what the Army thought it was buying. so the paper trail on this one runs backward, and the verdict inside it is unmistakable. An army that had spent a fortune on rifles decided its riflemen needed a hatchet as well. Nobody issues a second weapon unless the first one is expected to fail. Step back and look at what the soldier was actually holding. In the early 1870s, the Ordnance Department ran field trials on scores of rifles and carbines from American and foreign makers. Repeaters were available and were entered. Winchester, Spencer. The board chose a single shot instead, the trapdoor Springfield, and among the reasons were manufacturing economy and efficient use of ammunition. Army appropriations were at a low ebb, and the Springfield was cheap. The board of officers that made that decision included Alfred Terry and Marcus Reno. Both men would still be serving in 1876. The weapon had a specific flaw. Its early cartridges used copper cases, and copper swells when a chamber gets hot. The extractor would tear through the soft rim and leave the spent case jammed in the breech, at which point a trooper had to pry it out, often with a knife bought from the post sutler. The Army knew, because after 1876, Springfield Armory was ordered to design a cleaning rod for the carbine that could double as a tool for driving out stuck cases. It came as a 3-piece steel rod carried in the butt, and the stock had to be altered to hold it. An archaeological survey of the Little Bighorn Field in 1983 found prying marks on roughly 3% of recovered cases, so the jamming was not the whole story of that defeat. But the Army built the fix anyway, which tells you what it believed. Back to the countdown. Number 7, and this one should not have worked at all. In the mid-1860s, a United States Army surgeon named Elliott Coues was posted to Fort Whipple in Arizona Territory. By his own description, the military and civil forces there were in continuous action. Arrow wounds came through his hospital steadily enough that in 1866, he published a clinical paper on them. His description of the Apache arrow is precise, because he was writing for other surgeons who would have to treat one. The shaft was light, tough reed, close to 3 feet long, feathered in 3, and painted with waved lines in red and blue. Into the forward end was set a shorter piece of hard wood, 8 to 10 inches, straightened and hardened in fire, and smeared thickly with a black gummy substance. The head itself was quartz, chalcedony, or obsidian, always white or black, roughly an inch long and 1/3 of an inch wide. A narrow triangle, very thin, the point chipped to an extreme fineness. Coues wrote that the head looked like a small and trifling affair compared with the results it was capable of producing. Understand what that sentence is. It is 1866. It is a trained physician in United States Army uniform, in a service equipped with metallic cartridges, writing a professional paper about a chipped stone point because it kept arriving in his hospital inside his own soldiers. Every man at that post carried a manufactured firearm. The wounds Coues had to write a paper about came from stone. Number 6. The same weapon, different material. In that same 1866 paper, Coues pointed his readers toward Dr. Bill's earlier work and drew a distinction that mattered enormously to any surgeon working the frontier. The wounds made by the fine stone heads of the Apache were not the same as the wounds made by what he called the strong, large metal heads of the Navajo. Different tribes, different heads, different injuries, different surgery. This is where the trade economy turns back on the people who built it. Barrel hoops, wagon tires, discarded pans, worn-out files, all of it cut down, filed and mounted. Metal that arrived on the frontier inside the American supply system, leaving it again as arrowheads. And it created a professional problem the Army had to solve. A surgeon needed to know which tribe he was dealing with before he opened a wound, because the shape and size of the thing inside the man changed what he had to do next. Dr. Bill made the same point from Fort Defiance. An intimate knowledge of the tribes, he wrote, was valuable to a surgeon, because different tribes used arrows of different lengths. Read that as what it is. Tribal identification had become a surgical prerequisite in the United States Army. And notice the direction the metal was traveling. Iron reached the frontier as American manufactured goods and left it as arrowheads, which meant the industrial advantage the rifle was supposed to represent was arming the weapon on the other side. Number 5, and this is the item the Army physically collected. In 1881, Captain H.S. Kilbourne, an assistant surgeon in the United States Army, delivered an address on arrow wounds. He opened by telling his audience that this was a branch of military surgery not treated in the standard works, one that many military surgeons were themselves unfamiliar with. Then he described the specimens: bone, penetrated, perforated, and fissured in a variety of ways. And for some of them, Kilbourne reached for a comparison that is difficult to shake. He said they resembled the appearance of glass through which a pistol ball had been fired a few yards off, not cracked, not broken, shattered outward in a radiating pattern, the way a pane goes when a bullet passes through it. That is a stone or iron point launched from a wooden bow, doing to human bone what Kilbourne compares to a gunshot through glass. And note where those specimens were. Kilbourne is citing Dr. Otis of the United States Army and the reports on surgical cases in the Army. This material was in the Army's own medical collection, cataloged, preserved, studied. The service was not just losing men to this weapon, it was keeping the bones. There is a reason so much of this list comes from doctors. The Army's response to the bow was not only tactical, it was medical, and it was expensive, and it generated more paper than almost anything else in the frontier record. In 1860, a young physician named Joseph Howland Bill was commissioned a first lieutenant and posted to Fort Defiance in New Mexico Territory. He was trained at Jefferson Medical College, and he arrived to find himself treating a category of wound that medicine had essentially no literature on. So he wrote the literature. It ran to about 22 pages, published in 1862, and it has stood since as the definitive American account of arrow wounds. He also had to build hardware. Bill designed a long forceps carrying a wire loop that could be run down an embedded shaft to catch a head that had come free. Officers of the United States Army were writing medical papers and inventing surgical instruments because of a weapon the service had already decided belonged to the past. Back to the countdown. Number 4, and this is the sentence the whole video has been building toward. Captain Kilbourne, in that same 1881 address, made a direct comparison between the bow and the firearms of his own service. He wrote that the rapidity of the discharge of arrows rivaled the fire of the first breechloader he knew of, and he added that the precision was sufficient to make it exceedingly uncomfortable for anyone in the vicinity. Sit with that. A serving captain and assistant surgeon in the United States Army in 1881, 5 years after the Little Bighorn, telling a room full of physicians that in volume of fire, the bow stood comparison with a breech-loading rifle. He was not being sentimental. He was a military surgeon describing a casualty-producing mechanism to other doctors, and understatement is the register of the whole address. He calls the subject curious rather than practical. He calls incoming archery uncomfortable. That is the voice of a man who has stopped being surprised. And it is the entire argument of this list, delivered by the Army about itself. On the specific measure the rifle was supposed to have won on, which is how much fire you can put out in how little time, an Army officer put the older weapon level with the newer one. Number 3, the same weapon, in the dark. Colonel Richard Irving Dodge spent 33 years on the frontier. West Point, class of 1848. 43 years in uniform. Aide-de-camp to General William Tecumseh Sherman. In 1882, he published his account of what he had seen, and Sherman himself wrote the introduction. Inside that book is one of the most quietly alarming sentences an American officer ever put into print. Dodge wrote that for the purpose of picking off sentinels without creating an alarm, the bow was superior to the firearm. Consider what that means from inside a fort. A rifle announces itself. Muzzle flash, report, a direction to face, a garrison coming awake. An arrow does none of it. The sentry on the perimeter goes down, and the next man does not know for minutes, possibly not until morning. Sherman's own aide, in a book carrying Sherman's name on the front, told the reading public of 1882 that the older weapon was better at killing his soldiers quietly. The Army did not suppress that. It published it, with a general's endorsement on the first page. Number 2, and this is the one the surgeons feared. Return to Dr. Bill, because his central finding is the hardest fact on this list. Having treated these wounds personally, he concluded that arrow wounds were more likely to prove fatal than gunshot wounds, more fatal than bullets. Published in a medical journal in 1862, written by a United States Army officer. The reason was design, and Kilbourne described the mechanism precisely in 1881. The head was bound to the shaft with dried sinew. Inside a wound, that binding softened in the fluids of the body, so if the arrow was not taken out at once, the head worked loose and detached the moment anyone attempted extraction. So the instinctive act, gripping the shaft and pulling, drew out the wood and left the iron or stone behind. Buried. Invisible. Nothing left protruding to grip. That is why Bill built his wire loop. And where the head had entered bone, Kilbourne noted, it became impacted and held fast by the compact tissue, and getting it out could become both difficult and hazardous. Bill knew that from his own hands. He described bracing his knees against a patient to generate the force needed to free a head from the shaft of an upper arm bone, and being caught by a hospital steward when it finally gave way and he went over backward. He also recorded the detail that explains the penetration. He had seen an arrow, shot from 100 yards, buried so deeply in an oak plank that heavy forceps and considerable force were needed to draw it out. An oak plank, at 100 yards. Every word of that is in the Army's own medical literature, written by men in uniform. Before number 1, notice what every source in this video has in common. Bill at Fort Defiance, Coos at Fort Whipple, Kilbourne addressing the Buffalo Medical Club, Otis and the Army's surgical reports, Dodge with Sherman's introduction, Horton before a federal commission, Carrington reporting to his superiors, the Ordnance Department board that chose the Springfield. Every one of them is a United States Army document. There is a reason for that, and it is not generosity. Armies produce paper, casualty returns, surgeons' notes, ordnance boards, courts of inquiry, memoirs written in retirement to settle old scores. When something goes wrong, the institution documents it, because someone will eventually have to answer for it. So the most reliable surviving record of these weapons was written by the men they were used against, in the act of explaining to Washington what had happened to them. Which brings us to number 1, where the explanation is a list of names. Number 1, and it is not a single object. It is what happens when the weapon at number 4 is used by 2,000 men at once. December 21st, 1866. Fort Phil Kearny sat on the Bozeman Trail, roughly 200 miles from the nearest telegraph line, in country the government had already guaranteed by treaty. That morning, a wood train was attacked. A relief detachment went out. A small group of decoys, among them a young Oglala named Crazy Horse, drew the column over a ridge and out of sight of the fort. On the far side, a force estimated at up to 2,000 Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho fighters waited on both flanks of the ridge. 81 men went over that ridge. The fighting lasted roughly 40 minutes, and now the finding this entire video has been walking toward. Dr. Horton examined the dead, and his opinion, recorded in the official aftermath, was that not more than 6 of those 81 had been killed by gunfire. Carrington's report describes whole arrows removed from the bodies in quantity. You will find a figure of 40,000 arrows repeated in popular retellings of this fight. It appears in no primary account, and this video will not treat it as fact. It does not need to. The surgeon's finding is worse than any estimate, because it is not an estimate. It is a professional judgment on 81 specific bodies by the man who examined them. At the time, it was the worst defeat the United States Army had ever suffered on the Great Plains, and it held that distinction for 10 years, until the Little Bighorn. One detail survives from the end. The last man alive appears to have been a bugler named Adolph Metzger, who seems to have fought with his instrument once everything else was gone. His bugle was found crushed. His body, alone among the 81, was left unmutilated and covered with a buffalo hide. Even the men who won that fight left something behind to be read. The rifle did not end any of these weapons. That is what this list is really about. There was no clean handover, no mourning when the bow became a museum piece and the cartridge took the field. The two shared the ground for a century, and for most of that century, the men holding the modern weapon were the ones filing reports about why it had not been enough. The proof is not in mythology. It is in a post-surgeon's casualty finding at Fort Phil Kearny. It is in a captain's address comparing a bow to a breechloader in 1881. It is in an ordnance board choosing a cheap single shot over a repeater. It is in a colonel's book, with a general's name on the cover, admitting in print that the older weapon killed sentries better. Picture Elliott Coues at Fort Whipple in 1866, writing out the exact dimensions of a chipped stone point in an army that had metallic cartridges, because that stone point kept arriving in his hospital inside his own men. So here is the question. If you were standing on that ridge in 1866, holding a single-shot carbine, which of these 10 would you least want coming at you? Put the number in the comments. Subscribe, and I will see you on the next one.